Welcome to Recombination Nation. Today I have managed to land a really big fish. James Howard Kunstler is one of, I think, the most consistent and influential influencers in my life. I started following him back in the early 2000s. I during the golden age of the internet during the oil drum era, which for some of our younger listeners might be kind of legendary by now, but I think he's been a really key influence in redirecting my life to sidestep the long emergency that is all around us if you're paying attention. So yeah, he's a new urbanist. He's a prolific writer, though I think he's maybe better described as relentless than prolific. But he's ultimately somebody who notices things and he helps other people see them as well. And I think that makes him an artist at the most fundamental level. So I'll throw over to you, Jim. Do you want to tell us a bit more about like who you are for an audience who may not have seen your work, and maybe wind a path through your life? Like, how did you end up in this direction in life?
How did I become remorseless? Well, uh, it's funny that you should mention artistry because that's been the main thrust of my blog, Clusterfuck Nation, which has been going for about 20 years. And my main aim is to bring some kind of literary artistry to political commentary and economic commentary because otherwise it's so hard to read and so boring. So, and I come from that from background. I'm very old now, you see. I've been writing novels for many, many decades, and that's a whole other part of my life that takes place in a different part of my brain. So I was a journalist early on in the 70s. I worked for the hippie newspapers of Boston, Massachusetts. I then got a job on a daily newspaper. I then got hired by Rolling Stone magazine, which was at the time in the early 70s attempting to professionalize its staff. And they were hiring young people who had real journalistic experience, and I was one of them. It turned out that I really didn't like that job. It was a glamour job, but I wasn't happy there. And that by the time I was about 25, I made a very conscious decision to drop out of corporate journalism and from being a salary mule. And I had a motorcycle in San Francisco where Rolling Stone was headquartered at the time, and I rode it across the country back to upstate New York and hunkered down in Saratoga Springs, which is a lovely small town in the Hudson Valley, and started writing novels. And I published about eight of them, and with big time trade publishers. But I was still waiting on tables after my eighth book came out, and there was something peculiar about that. If I had known that was going to work out that way, my approach might have been different. But then I veered back into journalism. I got a blind phone call out of the blue from the New York Times Sunday magazine asking me to go out and do some assignments, which I did. And one of them turned into a book proposal for a book called The Geography of Nowhere, which was about the fiasco of suburban property development and how it was wrecking our society in many insidious ways that had barely been reckoned. And it became a popular book. All of a sudden, I didn't have to wait on tables anymore. I was getting lecture invitations to colleges, and that prompted me to write another book on the subject of urban design and basically how we design the human habitat in, the Anglosphere, or this part of it, and yours too. And that was called Home from Nowhere, and that connected me with the new urbanist movement. A lot of really great people. And then, I wrote a series of other nonfiction books, including The City in Mind, which was about sort of a survey of world cities, and The Long Emergency, which was about, having written about suburbia, one couldn't help but notice that the whole thing hinged on the petroleum situation, which was not looking that great about the year 2000, and in fact was getting a little bit more dire each year after that. And so the long emergency was largely pegged to the peak oil phenomenon, although to other things, to also very much to the economic fuckery that was going on, the financial fuckery, I should say,
Mm.
in the banking and investment quarter. And that led to another kind of a sequel, which was called Too Much Magic, because at the time, you began to notice that a tremendous amount of wishful thinking in the culture, that technology was going to rescue us from all of these conundrums and these paradoxes and conundrums of hyper complexity. Uh, and uh, so Too Much Magic was concerned with that. And then I started writing novels again, and I wrote a series of four novels about what American life would look like after an economic collapse. So that was the World Made by Hand series. And and I'm back to writing novels. I've got a new novel coming out, and the world hasn't collapsed quite yet, but it seems to be moving there at a faster clip now. The novel I've got coming out, we can talk about that later. But
Absolutely.
there's one thing I really got to say that in my long emergency book, which was published in 2005, which kind of anticipated the set of problems that we see around us now. The one thing that I missed, the big thing I missed, was how crazy these circumstances would make the
Mm.
population, just how insane people would get. And now we're living in the midst of this insanity. It's, I think, arguably worse in other quarters of the Anglosphere than in America. I think it's certainly worse in Britain and probably worse in Australia still.
Mm.
But we're in the thick of it. It's pretty bad in America. I'm sure you've heard we've had political assassinations lately, and the crazy is still very much in force. So
Would
that
you
brings us up to speed.
that was a brilliant summary. Would you um agree that the current dynamic in particularly Western society, it's kind of like a faction-based game of musical chairs, where like groups of people are trying to like push others out of the way to sit on the shrinking pool of chairs to stay in the game?
I love the word dynamic because it suggests that there are many complex interrelationships going on between things moving. It's
Mm.
a kind of calculus. And the musical chairs analogy, I think, is a pretty good one too, um, because we're basically dealing with, kind of a shrinking resource base and all of the maneuvering that goes on behind that.
Now, first thing I want to jump into talking about is suburbia and urban planning, because I think that's where you kind of first burst onto the scene. And my provocative question is this: is the Starship Enterprise the only walkable community in the common American imagination?
That's a great one. It's not, but they're few and far between. The most conspicuous one really is Disneyland
Hmm. Hmm.
and Disney World. And the funny thing about Disney World is that all of these people come from everywhere in the United States, Minnesota and Arizona, and all of these places, and they go to Disney World to walk down Main Street and to feel good about being in a place that is, suited to their neurology. And then they go back to these horrible environments in Minnesota and Dallas, Texas, and New Jersey, Hackensack, New Jersey, to the six laners and the muffler shops and all the furnishings of the suburban crapola environment. And they do everything possible to increase the discomfort of themselves and their loved ones with the rules and regulations for building all this crap. They never learn the lesson, that being in a properly proportioned, well-designed walkable community is actually very satisfying. And, you know, the bottom line of all this is that the suburban milieu is is unbelievably punishing to our human nervous system. It makes people feel terrible. It makes them paranoid. It is oppressive. It makes them nervous and anxious. And I don't think anybody's managed to notice that. You know, and in the meantime, we're in the midst of this, you know, prescription medicine craze for all of these pharmaceuticals that will calm people down and make them feel close to something normal, but it doesn't work.
Mm.
And, you know, they return to these terrible environments where children cannot learn how to develop their wayfinding ability. You know, this is a very important developmental issue
Mm.
that if children at a certain age, probably between, you know, 6 and 13, need to find a way to get around their own milieu, their own environment on their own. It's called wayfinding.
Mm.
And this is a precursor to adults and adulthood, to learning how to navigate through adult life. And if you don't learn how to navigate through your environment as a child, you're going to have a hard time navigating through adult life. And I think it's one of the things that's responsible for a lot of the mental illness that we're seeing among young people, you know,
Mm.
and the self-punishment that they subject themselves to as a result, you know, making themselves look bad, you know, turning their hair blue and putting bones through their noses and, you know, tatting up their bodies like, you know, as though they were billboards or televisions, you know, and, you know, ballooning up to 250 pounds. You know, it's a dreadful thing that's happening to these young people. And I think it's because their anxiety level is just off the charts.
Do you think the mass adoption of television coinciding with the mass movement to the suburbs acted as a kind of like artificial sweetener that made the new landscape more palatable, that people could like not spend less time looking out the window and more time watching the boob tube?
Well, that's a very interesting point, Shane. You're quite right. You know, Tom Wolfe, the great American writer, uh, said something very interesting in his book from Bauhaus to Our House, which was about modern architecture. Not so much urbanism. I don't think that he wrote that much about it, but architecture was something that really bugged him. And he mentioned that the picture window, so-called, in the suburban house was not there for the people who bought the house and ended up living in it, because there's nothing to look at it. It's for the realtor, the property seller, who drives up with the customer and says, "Look, picture window."
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's where it begins and ends. And so, yeah, you're quite correct. There's nothing to see out in that environment except a bunch of identical houses. And by the way, I've been to the suburbs of Melbourne and Perth and Sydney
Yeah,
and Brisbane.
yeah,
And,
yeah.
you know, I know that you have a very similar kind of deployment of the equipment out there. And so you're right that the television affords you a window on the world that is much more interesting than the real one out there. And to make it worse for children is, you know, as I said a few minutes ago, it's very hard for them to get around their daily environment without the assistance of the family chauffeur, which is mom, and the car.
Mm.
And so unless they are taken somewhere to the clarinet lesson or the dance lesson or the rugby field or whatever they're doing, um, they're not going to really see much on their own. I mean, they can go out into the cul-de-sac street and make up imaginary games on their bicycles, which kids do, and they're good at that. But they don't really get out to relate to the real world. You know, I had the interesting experience as a child in the 1950s and 60s. That I was born in New York City, and we spent my first 5 years out there in living in an apartment in New York. And in 1954, we moved out to the Long Island suburbs, 20 miles from Manhattan. I don't know if Aussies have much of a sense of American geography, but so we were in the Long Island suburbs, and uh, I experienced what that was like, and it's a very good place for a kid to live during the ages of, 5, 6, 7.
Mm.
But after that, you need to have something to do with the real world. You have to be able to buy stuff in a store, buy a Coca-Cola, go to a movie on your own and do stuff like that. When I was 8 years old, my parents split up and I moved back to Manhattan with my mom. And all of a sudden, and the rules of childhood were very different then. Plus, I had a working mom, and I was unsupervised. So I was at large in Manhattan in New York, the center of New York City, at the age of 8. And I learned how to navigate that myself. And, I took myself to the Museum of Natural History to see the shrunken heads and the big model of the blue whale. And I took myself to Yankee Stadium on the subway to watch the Yankees play on my own. And I took myself out to Chinese restaurants where you could, get lunch for 35 cents back in those days. And I learned how to navigate that world. Meanwhile, my daddy remained out in suburbia. He married a gal down the block of the suburban subdivision that my parents had lived in when they split up. And I continued to see my old suburban friends on my visitations to daddy, which were kind of twice a month affairs. And my friends had no idea how to do any of the things that I was learning to do at age 8. They'd never taken themselves to a Chinese restaurant and ordered lunch. They'd never taken themselves to a ballpark without dad's assistance, driving in from the suburbs in a car. They'd never done any of that. They'd never taken a ferry boat, to Staten Island or anything like that. So anyway, I began to notice how retarded they were. And naturally, it climaxed in the 1960s with them as teenagers having nothing to do at age 15 except hide in the basement and smoke marijuana and listen to Beatles records. And that sort of replaced television for them and for many American kids, maybe Australian kids too. So yeah, there's a tremendous dynamic between the development of TV and all of these strange psychological phenomena that we see in people who now comprise the adult population.
Just another question that comes off the top of my head, and I hope I got a balance getting through all of the things I want to talk about. But do you think the arrival of television was more shocking and deleterious than the subsequent arrival of the internet? Like the internet is kind of more of the same, but maybe not the same scale of impact. Or I don't know.
That's a
Is
good
it hard to
question.
compare the two?
Um, I would come to the conclusion that the internet was much more disturbing
Hmm.
to human relations. Um, yeah, I think the introduction of TV was quite it was really simpler. Um, it had the effect of kind of cartoonifying the world for us
Hmm.
in a way that is rather unfortunate. It took a lot of the sort of ornamentation out of adult life and turned it all into a simple-minded cartoon.
Mm.
Even the psychodrama became cartoonish, relations between men and women. But the internet has really been that's been a real ball buster.
Mm. Have
And both of us participate in it. Even for me, it's become a vocation.
mm,
I've been involved for the last 20 years in a transition between hard copy publishing and internet publishing, and I had
mm,
to make that transition in order to continue to support myself.
I definitely want to talk about that more later too. Um, Now, famously, you've said that suburbia was the greatest misallocation of resources in human history. What do you think we could have done with that inheritance instead? And could it have actually been worse than just like burning it all in one big party?
It's really hard to say because I'm dogged by the fact that if you go to Europe, and which I've done, quite a few times, and you notice how wonderful the towns and cities are there, and how nourishing social life can be in
Mm,
those places. You also can't fail to notice how screwed up those societies can can make themselves.
mm,
We're seeing it happen now. You have these beautiful cities and beautiful towns in France and Germany and Italy and the Netherlands, and they're in the process of completely destroying themselves, just having made a set of terrible choices. So, and if you go back in history a bit, you take your choice, go back to 1914 or 1938. In both cases, you have these wonderful civilizations with wonderful urbanism and towns that are really a pleasure to live in, and full of miserable people who end up making terrible political choices and then destroying themselves literally.
mm,
I'm dogged by this vision of what it would be like to have survived World War II in Berlin and be walking down the street, the Unter den Linden in 1946, when the whole avenue was reduced to gravel and having that memory of what it was like before the war
mm.
and what you had done to your culture. It's very daunting. And so here in America, and also I think from what I observed in Australia, we made the choice to suburbanize our cultures. And I do think that it was the greatest misallocation of resources. It's hard to say what else we might have done in America, but probably what we would have done is made a whole set of different choices around the major institutions in our lives, like education and medicine.
Mm,
And it is interesting to notice that education and medicine in the United States, at least, are the two institutions that are most that that have to be most centered on truth and probity, doing the right thing. And in our case here, they have been the two institutions that have betrayed that those values most.
mm, mm,
And are now in the process of utterly destroying themselves. Education in America is a wreck.
mm.
They are failing to teach children even how to read simple books and add up a column of figures.
Oh, well, I kind of I love metaphors, and I kind of think of what humanity has gone through as a little bit like a mosquito that hit an artery of like high pressure blood that just blew it up like a balloon. Like it was so much more than we were ever accustomed to dealing with, and or like a fairly disorganized person who gets a lottery win and they have suddenly millions of dollars in the bank, and it's almost guaranteed to ruin them.
Yeah. Well, this has been described by other people as the victory disease.
Mm,
After a war that you have won triumphantly, you're planting the seeds of your own destruction. And, it might take a while to get there, but we succeeded in doing that in the United States. And, after the Second World War, we could make anything that we wanted to make and lend all the other ruined countries in the world the money to buy the stuff that we made. And we prospered magnificently. And, to the point, again, as Tom Wolfe pointed out, where the average plumber in America was living better than Louis the XIV.
mm.
And so that's how things worked out for a while. And then we just elaborated it and elaborated it more and more until we really started to wreck ourselves. And here we are, 75 years later. Um, And the population is unbelievably sick and unhealthy, something that has been finally noted by the government, by our new government. And they are financially wrecked. They're in debt up to their eyeballs. They can't, they're nervous wrecks. They can't pay for their mortgages, their rent, their food, their car payments. Their children are going crazy, becoming Aboriginal savages and not learning how to read. And and everybody is going crazy to one degree or another. So here we are, we're really kind of lurching into some kind of a terminal phase here. And there is a hope in America that the people around Mr. Trump, maybe not Mr. Trump himself, because he's a peculiar guy, but at least the people around him seem to be very capable. And there's a hope that they're going to rescue the country from a lot of this. And we do see a lot of rescue attempts going on. Um, Robert Kennedy Jr.'s attempt to get America healthy again is really a major thing, addressing an obvious problem. And yesterday, our Secretary of War, as he's been newly styled, no longer the Secretary of Defense, but the Secretary of War, which implies a certain degree of seriousness there that wasn't there before. He brought all these generals into one room from all around the world and read them the Riot Act and told them, no more dressing up as mom and no more 300-pound generals walking down the halls of the war ministry. So we are attempting to get serious about that. I think Mr. Trump's economic program he's attempting, through this tariff business to try to reorganize world trade in a way that for our country at least would be more balanced.
Mm.
Uh, I don't know if that will overcome our terrible, terrible debt problem and our terrible spending problems. And so it remains to be seen whether Donald Trump can rescue the United States. But in the meantime, our behavior is really, really dispiriting.
Mm. I'm a little bit reminded too of the old Aesop's fable, The King of the Frogs. I don't know if
I
you know
forget
that
that
one.
one.
Uh, to tell it very quickly, the frogs are partying in the swamp and they realize, oh, we want a king. So they call up to the gods, say, send us a king, and a log falls down into the mud, and the gods are like, there's your king. And the frogs cheer and they're dancing around, and we got a new king. But then they notice the king doesn't actually do very much. So they call up to the gods again and say, send us a better king. We want like one that's strong and powerful, decisive. And the gods send down a heron that proceeds to eat like one frog after another. So, yeah,
That's great. I don't remember that one, but it's a good one. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, that could be the case. Although I wouldn't say that Donald Trump is a log. He's really doing a lot.
mm,
He's just attempting to do a lot. A lot of the things he's trying to do are being thwarted by a kind of runaway judiciary that's been captured by his opponents and was already captured because they had time to appoint them. But that's being undone too by the higher courts, which are undoing the judgments that were thrown in his way to thwart him. So
mm,
just the other day, I think yesterday, a higher court undid an order against applying the Aliens Enemy Act, which was invoked to try to clean up the invasion of illegal immigrants. And Mr. Trump was using the Aliens Act to make it easier to deport these people. And a judge interfered and said, no, you can't do that. I'm issuing a ban to stop that. So a higher court has now stepped in and undone the ban.
mm,
So it remains to be seen, where that will go from there. But sequentially, that's happening in just about every case where they've thrown a roadblock in front of him. So, in effect, he's not really a log. He's very effective. But, we're in a situation where, as you point out in Aesop's fable, that, he's only got a 4-year term and he's 1 year into it. And God knows if things get bad enough, America could fall into the hands of some kind of a great blue heron
Mm, mm.
eating all the frogs. Right now, the Democratic Party, which is the opposition party to Mr. Trump, has gone completely off its rocker. It's completely insane. It proposes things that a 6-year-old would not believe in, and yet it persists in doing this and makes itself very obnoxious and very destructive to our culture and our country. And if they got into power again through some great failure of politics or through some tremendous financial accident, like if we had a banking crisis or a currency crisis or a gross inflation, and the Democrats were able to turn around and get back into power, God knows what they would do. Um, I think that it would provoke a real armed revolt.
Um,
So.
wh- I want to talk about more politics later, but before I forget, do you think that in their current state, the Democrats could be vulnerable to I guess you'd call it a corporate hostile takeover, similar to what Trump did to the Republicans when they were more of a spent force before he kind of crashed into the scene?
Well, that's a very good point that you're the first person to have articulated that point.
Mm.
Uh, it's an excellent point because they have made themselves so vulnerable. They have no credible leadership. And one can easily see the party having to be taken over by somebody with some sense. Now whether it is a corporate type person,
Mm.
in the same sense that Mr. Trump was an entrepreneur who, in effect, a corporate operator who came out of the business world and took over the Republican Party. Perhaps somebody will have to do that to the Democratic Party, somebody who can think straight. But they're in terrible shape. I mean, one of the other alternative is they will fade away and disappear like the oh
Oh, the
God,
Whigs.
yeah, excuse me, yeah, excuse me, the Whig Party in America in 1856, which, the Whigs were running the country for about 30 years
Mm.
in the early 19th century in America. And in 1856, all of a sudden they vanished like into a black hole. Like,
Mm.
anybody see the Whigs? They were here a moment ago and now they're gone. And that's because they could not they could not come to grips with the whole question of slavery.
Mm.
And they just ignored it to such a degree that they made themselves irrelevant.
Mm.
And yeah.
Now, getting back onto suburbia, what do you think of promises and efforts uh, along the lines that suburbia could feed itself, that it could actually produce its own food with a few tweaks?
Unlikely. Yeah, I think it's pretty unlikely. It's certainly true that you know, I guess logistically, physically, that you could plant a garden in a front yard or a backyard. You could do it, but there are so many other systems that you need to depend on. You know, feeding yourself is not just a freestanding solo system.
Mm.
We live in a matrix of complex systems that are all interdependent. And the failure of one tends to increase the chances of the failure of the others.
Mm.
When the trucking system gets into trouble, and that's happening in the United States in a very big way. The trucking companies are going out of business. We have this terrible problem with illegal aliens being hired at low rates to drive the trucks, and they can't speak English, and they can't read the signs on the highway. And they drive into overpasses and they do stupid things and create accidents. So now the government is having to remove their licenses on a wholesale basis, and the trucking companies do not have enough drivers to take all the stuff around.
Hmm.
Well, when the trucking supply lines fail, people are going to find the shelves in the stores empty. And these things thunder through the system. So yeah, just growing a turnip in your front yard isn't going to cut it.
Hmm. In your area, you're in upstate New York, which is more rural. Have you seen any green shoots of post-industrial agriculture returning to that landscape?
Well, there has been for many years. There are enterprising people who, the agricultural scene here. I'm in Washington County, New York, which is 200 miles from New York City and 200 miles from Boston and Montreal, equidistant really from all these three cities,
Mm.
which is far enough. And it was mostly a dairy farming area for the 20th century, really since the development of the electric milking machine and its other component, the Holstein cow,
Hmm.
which was a much bigger producer of milk than the previous types of cows. So you put those two things together along with bulk refrigeration and the truck, the diesel powered truck, and all of a sudden you've got a system. Well, that worked for, about 100 years, and now it's going out here. The dairy farmers here can't compete in scale with dairy farmers in Wisconsin and California and elsewhere. And so they've been going out of business. And so farmland has come up for sale. And people are trying to do different things with it. Many of them are running organic farms of one kind or another. They're doing experiments like raising buffalo instead of beef. Many of them have turned to raising beef cattle instead of milk cows because, it eliminates a big pain in the ass part of a dairy operation is that the dairyman is pinned to his property
Mm.
by having to milk the cows twice a day. He can never get away. He can never have a vacation. It's terrible. It's hard on them. But, the stockman, on the other hand, is in a different situation.
Mm.
So we have the boutique vegetable growers, with the trouble is that there are many problems with it. One of them is that their networks for marketing are very frail and tiny and fragile, namely the farmers markets, which are mostly entertainment venues for well-off people. They're not a real part of the the feeding the people economy. So until the supermarkets and the giant stores get into trouble, that system is not going to rearrange itself. And as I said a little while ago, it's it's a system of systems. It's a matrix of systems. So the whole matrix has to rearrange itself, not just the growing of the crops, but the value added part of it, and that's been completely destroyed. In my area, we used to have many small cheese factories and small dairies and small value added companies that made products out of the things that were grown here. That's gone completely. And that was one of the systems within the system of agriculture locally that fed people, but also created goods for markets, elsewhere. Like we grew potatoes around here for the New York City market because we're 4 miles from the Hudson River, which is a direct water route to New York City, very cheap transportation. So you have a bulk commodity like potatoes and you put it on a barge and send it down to New York, and it's a profitable enterprise. So you see how these things all, interrelate. It's a dynamic, as you began saying.
Well, one thing I just thought to ask you, you might know more about this development. I believe not long ago there was a Supreme Court judgment that government departments can't make policies independently that are de facto laws. And particularly the agriculture industry, there were a lot of these regulations that were being created and enforced as if they were laws. And that has been, I think, struck down, but maybe the implications and the applications of that are still working their way through the system. And they need small farmers to like challenge and say, no, you don't have the right to enforce something that you made up and didn't run through Congress or any other legislature. Do you have any idea of what's happening on that front?
Well, you're quite right about that. That was, I don't remember the name of the case, uh, but basically it said, you laid it out as it was said, that the executive agencies can't just create regulations as if they were laws.
Mm.
You know, they have to be much more prudent about that. And no, it has not worked itself out yet. There's a great deal of controversy about how it will work out. And of course, the major problem is that agriculture has become such uh, an enterprise reliant on gigantism, that gigantism itself is an impediment to reform, because everything now has been calibrated to operate at such a gigantic scale in order to, for example, let's say a typical farm in the Midwest, has thousands of acres now, and they have to use machines that cost millions of dollars, these gigantic cultivators and tractor things, and they pay mortgages on them. They have to pay enormous amounts of money to just get the crop into the ground. And they borrow tremendous amounts of money every year to do that. So, a farmer will borrow $200,000 for all of the so-called inputs that go into growing soybeans and corn. And they grow thousands and thousands of acres of them. And the profit margins are kind of narrow. And a lot of bad things can happen with weather. Weather remain, that we haven't reformed the weather, and you still get floods and droughts and terrible events. And so we have not gotten to the point where we can de-giantize agriculture. The whole supply chain of food kind of depends on it, and by supply chain, again, we're talking about the supermarket way of distributing food to the population, and the whole industry of creating food products, many of them unhealthy, sugary cereals and chips and all kinds of garbage. And all of that is now so deeply established that it's hard to disassemble it and get back to something that is more local, more natural, healthier, and which affords different occupational niches for people to make a living, so that you don't just have one guy on a $6 million tractor producing all of the corn for 1 million people, but you have many people. I do think that we're coming into an era where farming is going to require more human attention
Mm.
for many reasons. We're going to have problems with petroleum. We're going to have problems running these machines. We're going to have problems with finance and debt, and we're not going to be able to lend farmers $200,000 a year to put a crop in.
Mm.
And all of these things are going to combine probably to make agriculture smaller again, and perhaps more local where it's possible. The trouble in the USA is that there are a lot of places in America that have been developed into population centers where you really can't grow food,
Mm.
and you can't do local agriculture very well. Places like Arizona and, even to some degree, Southern California, New Mexico. These are places that, will not support the populations that they have presently.
Mm.
So
Mm. It's going to be a
we got a
big,
lot to
big
work out.
disruption. Yeah.
Yeah, we got a lot to work out. It's going to be, that's why I called it the long emergency. That's why I
Yeah.
called that book, gave that book the title.
In parallel, have you seen any improvement on the front of zoning regulations for allowing people to design the landscape more effectively? Has that started to shift at all?
Well, it's a very interesting question, actually, because it did shift a great deal in the 1990s and early 2000s. The new urbanist movement was very effective in persuading local people to reform their zoning so that you could build traditional stuff again, which is to say buildings more than 1 story high, and to arrange them on the landscape so that they meaningfully defined public space, and in short, to create or recreate traditional towns that were satisfying places to live. And a lot of that happened. A lot of existing towns and cities improved their neighborhoods and districts and quarters. And that it remains an ongoing project. But, it's been kind of hijacked and interrupted by this terrible WEF business called the 15-minute city,
Ah,
which
yes.
has confused a lot of people. And so it's created, as you might say, again, a dynamic problem. One problem is that the 15-minute city proposed by the WEF resembles the traditional town and city or the new urbanist scheme, but it is more a scheme for surveillance and control of the population than for enabling social and business relations in a setting that is the urban setting.
Mm.
And so the conservatives in America are now all confused about what good urbanism is. They're beginning to think that good urbanism is a WEF scheme to oppress them. And they're starting to marginalize all of the good work that the new urbanists were doing for the previous 30 years and to castigate it. And I think the new urbanists have done a poor job of fighting back, partly because the main organization of the new urbanists, the umbrella org, has been taken over by the wokies, and they have been, distracting themselves with all of these uh, social justice bullshit endeavors
Mm.
instead of sticking to real reform of how we design the terrain for human habitation. And so it leads to another problem, which is suburbia has become the favorite living arrangement for the MAGA movement, for the Make America Great people, the Trump people. They identify suburbia as their stuff,
Hmm.
and it has only made them more resistant to reforming it. And on top of that, Mr. Trump has promised to drill, baby, drill, and solve our quandaries with the petroleum supply. Personally, I think that that's not going to work out the way he's promising. I think that um, we are actually reaching an end of the shale oil story.
Mm.
We're reaching the final chapters of that now. Um, the shale oil fields have particular properties that don't lend themselves to really long-term exploitation. Just the profile of how they produce is not promising. They produce a lot in the first couple of years and then they fall off the cliff.
Mm.
And they're much more expensive to develop than conventional oil fields. An old Oklahoma oil field in 1950 cost $400,000 in today's money to drill and start producing. And it produced for years and years and years, thousands of barrels a day. Whereas the typical shale oil well costs between $6 and $12 million in today's money to drill, and it produces maybe hundreds of barrels a day for the first 18 months, and then it falls off a cliff.
Mm. Yeah.
So it's a very, very different production and investment dynamic that worked really well in a cheap lending environment. But now that that's coming to an end, it has come to an end, really. Shale oil really flourished when we had 0% interest rates. And what that did was it drove investors out of safe investments like bonds that used to pay, a safe 5% a year into speculative oil stocks and things like that. And A lot of those oil companies actually went bankrupt. And but so anyway, that's the shale oil story in a kind of in a sketch.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Um,
What it implies is that, we're heading for problems with the oil supply.
mm. Do you think that material limits? I know lumber had an issue recently in the US with prices skyrocketing, that those kind of limits like lumber, steel, concrete might impact our capacity to redesign and rebuild our human habitats, that we're
Absolutely.
gonna be stuck with peeling tar paper suburbia.
Yeah, that is another interesting dynamic. I'm really glad you started off this conversation with that word because it's true. For one thing, we can bemoan suburbia as just, in terms of how it functions, but we also have to pay attention to the fact that much of it is crap building.
Mm,
The suburban houses are built out of strand board and vinyl. Strand board is that crap where they take a bunch of wood waste and they glue it together to make plywood sheets or sheets that resemble plywood, and then you build a house out of it. But this stuff disintegrates rapidly, especially if water gets in there. And vinyl, starts to deform under ultraviolet light very, very quickly. So that's what our stuff is. And I think what you're going to see is that suburbia has three destinies: either ruins, salvage yards, or slums,
mm,
probably in the reverse order: slums,
mm,
salvage, and ruins.
mm.
And we have no idea how we're going to contend with that. And I forgot part B. Oh, part B of that was that it takes a tremendous amount of energy to create a lot of these building components. So if we have problems with energy, we're going to have problems creating concrete, which cement takes a tremendous amount of heat to make. And all the other things too, the I-beams and the aluminum sashes and the plate glass. So I think you're going to see a tremendous salvage industry in suburbia where they're going to. Now, one thing that human beings are really good at is sorting shit out. So if you give human beings a big pile of junk, you know, and give them some cash incentive to go in there and sort it out, they'll put all the copper in one place and all the aluminum in another place and all the cinder blocks and bricks that are still intact in another place, and then they'll sell them, you
Mm.
know. You're going to see a lot of that. Now, there are big problems in America with our skyscraper cities because we're now seeing a phenomenon where the skyscraper has become obsolete. Now that we have the people working on their laptops at home, you in the United States we have a crisis of occupancy in the office towers. They're running at 40% occupancy.
Mm.
Now these towers they're business enterprises. They're mortgaged, they're financed. So now the occupancy is so low that the owners cannot pay the mortgages and the maintenance and the taxes the property taxes. And so the question is, what is going to be done with these under-occupied office towers? Well, they're not so easy to convert into apartments. And also, an additional problem is you have to think of the apartments as accessories to the office towers. If
Mm.
people aren't working in the office towers, fewer people are going to be living in the residential towers. So the whole dynamic is very screwed up. And then you have to add in the fact that it costs a lot of money to disassemble these buildings, even if you were going to salvage the materials.
Mm.
For a 70-story office tower, the Time Life building on 6th Avenue in New York City, it costs millions and millions of dollars to take that thing apart. So what is the destiny of those things? I don't know, man. I saw what I thought was a preview of coming attractions in Johannesburg because Johannesburg has a downtown roughly the size of Denver, or at least so it seemed. And all the office towers were abandoned because when apartheid ended, the corporations all abandoned the offices and they moved to fortified suburban headquarters in the north, as far away from Soweto as they could get. And so now all of these office towers have become squats. And poor people are living in like the 23rd floor, And the electricity is turned off, and they have to walk up with water. They have to carry water 23 floors up, and they're
Wow.
camping out in the offices. And like, to bring that back to America, let's say, the problem with renovating an office tower is that the plumbing stacks are generally only in two places, the men's bathroom and the women's bathroom. They're
Mm.
not configured easily so that you can turn the building into apartments. So, is that going to happen? Well, not without a whole lot of money that isn't there. So,
Mm. Yeah, it paints a striking picture of the future of cities. I have a provocative theory as well. I'm curious about your perspective on it. So, looking at the pre-industrial past of iron production, it was limited to places that had high quality surface ores, biomass for charcoal, and usually water power all close to each other. And in the industrial age, iron production like went up orders of magnitude per capita through harnessing coal and later oil and all of this extra technology. But part of me wonders if we might be facing a century or two of recycling the iron stocks that we have, and that after that, it could be the end of the Iron Age, that we would both forget how to do it and also not have the quality of resources to go back to biomass generated iron. So yeah, could the Iron Age actually come to an end?
well, that's exactly the picture that I would paint of the situation. Although I'm not sure how much we would lose, but remember when the Romans left Britain, the Britons or whoever they were at the time uh, forgot how to make pottery,
Mm,
and they stopped doing it. And they stopped bathing, and they stopped maintaining the baths at Bath, and that could very well happen. Like I said a few minutes ago, I think that salvage is going to be one of the big businesses of the decades ahead.
mm.
And then we'll see. It's hard to chart really where it goes from there, but I think you've painted a pretty clear and concise picture of it.
Well, a related question. I'm starting to wonder if industrial civilization might have peaked in like the 1890s, and that the whole 20th century transition to oil was like the first step in diminishing returns of complexity. That like we had to use the oil to get the lower quality coal out of the ground to keep the foundation of the industrial system humming. And I mean, now we're even using like solar panels on remote oil wells to squeeze a little bit more oil out of them. So, what's your thought on that take?
You must be my shadow twin or something because I have exactly the same thought. My idea would be that really the peak of civilization seems to have been around the year 1900.
Mm,
And you can see it in things like the paintings of John Singer Sargent. The one thing maybe that they lacked were some medical refinements, like really good dentistry that
mm,
that we have now, and open heart surgery and joint replacement. But apart from that, we seem to have become progressively decivilized, since 1914
mm,
in many important ways, certainly culturally. And if you look at the culture of the 20th century, after 1918, well, actually, after 1900, you see a kind of descent into madness in the arts, and as a kind of precursor to what we're seeing now, which is literal political madness, where
mm,
people are actually fighting politically over whether it's okay for men to swim in the women's swim lane in competition. I
mm.
mean, the idea that there would be any controversy over that is unbelievable. But
Mm,
there it is.
the speed and the pervasiveness of the transformation culturally is the thing that I find really interesting. The details could be anything, but it's this grasping for factionalism, the polarization. I think that's the take home message, even if you're not particularly interested in the details. Um,
Yeah, and the other component of it is that, it's become reality optional
mm,
for some people. You can opt out of reality
mm,
in among certain groups, and still they haven't suffered enough yet to understand that opting out from reality is not, it really isn't an option. It just seems to be that when you're insane and when you're, when you have the luxury of living in a sort of momentum of history that, affords you that kind of leisure.
I'm reminded of the old saying that all models are wrong, but some are useful. Does the same also apply to ideology?
I think that's a very good point. Yeah, well, we see them becoming, well, they seem to go in and out of usefulness.
Mm.
Um, um,
The trick is
liberal,
discarding them before they become absurd and suicidal.
yeah, liberal democracy, for example, was the reigning ideology of Western civ during the 20th century, and it seemed impregnable. You there you are standing on the conclusion of World War II, and everybody wants to be rational and everybody wants to behave themselves again and not descend into madness. And you get the United Nations, you get institutions to prevent descents into madness and war. And yet here we are, 4 generations later, descending back into war and madness. You see it in Europe most vividly, and Europe, of course, is the bastion of Western Civ and the birthplace, the cradle of Western Civ, and yet it's absolutely destroying itself with idiotic, mad ideology that derives from liberalism, but it no longer really resembles it. You see that in Germany, where the Germans were so determined to demonstrate to themselves that they weren't horrible people that Angela Merkel began this process of letting in millions of people who were really adversaries of Western Civ and now want to destroy it and and don't hesitate to tell the the remaining natives there that they want to destroy it. So, the madness is really just amazing. And now you see Ursula von der Leyen and the EU affecting to start up a war machine to supposedly defeat Russia. They're absolutely out of their minds. They don't have the capability to do that. Russia's got all the oil. Europe doesn't have the oil. And meaning they can't prosecute a war like that.
Mm.
So, but yet they're every day they're beating the war drum over there in Poland and in Brussels, and it's just an amazing display of insanity.
Well,
So, and
another.
and and just to get
Oh
back to
yes,
your
yeah,
point,
yeah.
that's the termination of Western civ liberalism.
Mm. Well, a similar, I guess you call it an ideology, is techno-optimism, and I've been thinking about what could precipitate a change in the zeitgeist around that. And I wonder if Elon Musk's kind of glowing beacon of techno-optimism collapsing at some point could be the kind of turning point, or is that do we need to freeze dry a few astronauts on Mars before that's going to happen?
I think the Martian project is insane.
Mm.
Basically we have a pretty good planet here that is best suited to human life. Why don't we learn how to live on this one before we venture into one that has no capacity to sustain our lives? It's just insane. To me, it's a waste of time at this point. I think that you're right. We're kind of looking for some, as our old Secretary of War Donald Rumsfeld used to say, you have the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. So uh, God knows, so many black swans have been flying into our life over the last 30 years that anything can happen. But I do expect some kind of a technological revolt, a revolt against tech,
Mm, mm,
and I think it will be hugely disappointing
mm.
for people. And I try to depict that in my World Made by Hand novels. And the most obvious candidate right now is artificial intelligence. It seems to be the one that's most obviously fraught with hazards, and we're trifling with it. And but that too has got like a comic angle to it because what nobody considers apparently is that the whole thing depends on the electric supply.
Hmm.
You know, if the electric is not coming into the plug in the wall, all those banks of computers in the server farms are not going to be working. And I don't know who they're going to send out there to do it for them.
I
You know, all,
it's a it's almost like a the internet was like the most complex resource intensive machine we've ever built, and but then they're like, hold my beer, I'm going to go one higher and make something even more complicated and
yeah.
then make it even more vital to have basic functions depend on it.
Yeah, and the capper on all that is that the electric grid in the USA anyway is probably the most fragile of all of the mega systems that we depend on.
Hmm.
So it's the most easily subject to failure and fragility. And so, it amuses me to think of all the people who are hoarding their bitcoins, not paying any attention to the fact that if the electricity goes off even for 3 days, that's the end of Bitcoin.
Mm.
So,
Well, assuming the whole shebang keeps going for a bit longer, could an era of techno-feudalism act as a dress rehearsal for post-tech feudalism, if that's kind of further out in the future?
well, again, you're making a great point. It could be a dress rehearsal in the sense that it accustoms people to being pushed around.
Mm.
And in America and Australia, where we don't have the same old class hierarchies that you get in India or Britain, where the classes are so distinct. There is this tendency in the human race to have hierarchical societies. And it's really the anomalous societies that are not strictly hierarchical. Uh, in America, we have a kind of cartoonish hierarchy or aristocracy of, idiot movie stars and Taylor Swift rock stars. And, that's our idiot aristocracy. Britain has its own idiot aristocracy of people, gentlemen who haven't had a job in 6 generations. And that's a different kind of idiocy, right? But I'm convinced that a lot of woke politics, as we call it here, has a lot to do with status maneuvering for people. All of this so-called virtue signaling has a lot to do with luxury beliefs and replacing material wealth for moral virtue, or the vice versa, replacing moral virtue for material wealth, because there is so much grotesque wealth that the people who have billions and billions of dollars, they can't improve their standards of living one bit by making another billion. So, what they can do is try to enhance their moral standing by militating to have men in the women's swim lane because it's fair to the trannies.
Mm.
So, you get this kind of insanity, but it's competitive. It's competitive jockeying for status.
I wanted to talk a bit about education because you mentioned it in the beginning as like one of
Mhm.
the cornerstones of society that is in kind of free fall at the moment. And one phenomenon that seems to be emerging that the best use of college or university is to get admitted into the most prestigious one possible and then drop out as a signal of like self-determination. Is that the only game left in town?
I haven't heard that one. That is really a new one. Up until recently, it has been to graduate from one of those elite places with a piece of paper that says that you're an aristocrat.
Mm.
I hadn't heard the dropout maneuver yet, but that's an interesting one. Yeah, the system of the whole educational system in America is in free fall. For one thing, in what we call K through 12, which is, do you have the same
Yeah,
terminology?
yeah.
Okay. What we call K through 12 suffered terribly from the movement of the last 70 years to consolidate all the schools into giant regional schools. And the idea was to save in administrative costs. But it created these gigantic institutions that are alienating to kids and fail to teach them and end up just producing strange social hierarchies of their own, like, the mean girls and the jocks and, the nerds who are all competing as though this was some sort of mini society, that required all this psychodrama.
Mm.
But in the meantime, they're not learning trigonometry and they're not learning literature or how to produce literature or how to even write, a coherent sentence. And all of that has become dependent on the yellow school bus system that we have in the USA. And that is dependent on the oil supply. So that's a dynamic that is not too good. And in America, we also have the racial component, which has been pretty ruinous. Um, for one reason or another, we refuse to teach the poor black populations in America how to speak English because we don't want to make them feel bad about their ghetto patois, about the language that they've developed in their mini ghetto societies. So we don't teach them how to learn. We don't teach them how to speak English, and as a consequence, it's very difficult for them to learn anything else. They can't learn to read, they can't learn to do math, and they can't really they can't enjoy instruction. So, and when I tried to introduce that idea that teaching language skills has got to be the primary mission of K through 12, people canceled me,
Mm.
literally. I was canceled off the lecture circuit for saying that, but it's the case. And that whole dynamic causes a sort of race to the bottom of quality education, and we can't escape uh, that self-feeding circuit now, and it's very unfortunate. So K through 12 is screwed up. College has lost its reason for existence by trying to jam every possible person into college in America. We created that terrible dynamic of debt, of creating government-backed college loans, which were given out in a profligate manner to people who could not had very little prospect of paying them back. And it prompted the colleges to raise their tuition, to hire more diversity managers and deans and provosts, etc., and make the whole cost of education higher, and then to create a whole inventory of idiotic fields of study that have no utility in real life, like, race studies and gender studies and stupid shit like that. And so people have now seen the futility of that. Now that the young people see that they do not want to go into debt for $100,000 to get a useless degree, college is becoming increasingly irrelevant. And now Mr. Trump is attacking the grant system, which is basically a grifting system of the colleges benefiting from taxpayer money to keep their games going. The whole game is unraveling now. I think it will. We're already seeing small colleges fail. In my corner of the country, we've seen 4 colleges fail in the last 24 months.
Wow.
Southern Vermont College, Johnson State College in Vermont, because I'm 10 miles away from the Vermont border. Um, uh, but there were 2 more.
Mm.
In
Ha-
any case, we're going to see a lot more of that.
yeah.
And
Well, I'm really
like
curious.
most
Yeah,
let me
yeah,
just say, like most
yeah.
phenomena, it will tend to go from the margins to the center.
Mm.
So you get the small 4-year colleges collapsing, and eventually, the big state universities get into trouble, and the elite Ivy League colleges get into trouble, and eventually there are far fewer students, and eventually college returns to being what it used to be, which is either a finishing school or a seminary.
Mm. Well, I wonder if you have any thoughts about the potential cultural impact of the exploding homeschooling movement, which I think is even further developed in the US and has no sign of slowing down.
Yeah, it's a big thing, and what it really amounts to is if you want your kids to be functional adults and read and write and know some basic math, it's now up to you, parent, to teach the kid how to do that. I do think that it's a kind of an intermediary step because ultimately, I think what will happen is that these homeschooling efforts will amalgamate into group homeschools, which will then amalgamate into small academies of some sort or another, and we'll be back to the small academy model of education.
It's
But
like
that's probably a process. Yeah,
anacyclosis of the education system. It's going through all
yeah.
levels of hierarchy and complexity. Now, I was a teacher for a while as well. Interesting diversion in my life, and I wonder if it's a occupation that went through a deprofessionalization in the 20th century, that teachers went from being trusted to operate independently and basically decide whatever happens in their classroom to being extremely micromanaged bureaucrats who have like so many forms and supervisors that they basically have no room to move anymore. And it's this kind
Yeah,
of
this is part of the general crisis of authority that we see in Western Civ. And it's very easy to understand. If you jam a whole lot of people into a profession who are incompetent, then people are no longer going to trust that they're competent.
mm,
And that's exactly what's happened. So,
yeah,
you know,
and you
you
end up
have,
with it's a feedback loop that you end up
oh,
with
absolutely. And
that
it's reinforced in
yeah.
America by the teachers union,
Mm.
which is one of the most powerful labor unions in America. And it basically run by, I'm sorry to say this, by people who are, have become, for one reason or another, Marxists. They were Marxists in their youth in the 1960s, and now they're returning to their youthful Marxism in their dotage, and they're still running these institutions. And, you know, out of the goodness of their heart, supposedly, they've given teaching certificates to all these people who can't read, write, know nothing about history. They're ignorant. They're
Mm.
ignoramuses. And so, of course, they're not trustworthy, so they're not trusted.
Has a similar dynamic degraded the medical system? I think doctors have gone through a more recent process of deprofessionalization in these big conglomerate.
Yeah, it works differently in medicine because the training for doctors remains pretty stringent, at least in terms of the time and money that you have to invest to get that to that place. But what they're doing is they're changing the professional hierarchies of their business model so that in America, you no longer see the doctor, you see the physician's assistant for anything short of a major systems failure of your body.
Mm,
So, and even in that case, you'd see a systems person.
mm.
I was having some chest pains about 4 years ago. It turned out to be a muscle spasm in a back muscle, but they sent me to the angio lab, to have a camera go up my veins into my heart and check out the vessels. And during that whole process, I never spoke to the cardiologist, only to the PA.
Mm, mm.
And that made an impression on me. My girlfriend had a major spine operation because she had a pretty bad injury. And I've been impressed with how little the doctors want to interact with her. And so yeah, so we're seeing a lot of that. But the whole medical model is absolutely falling apart.
Mm.
And they destroyed their trust, uh, their authority with the COVID operation.
There's a interesting parallel. I wonder what you think about this, that in pre-industrial Christian societies, the church kind of amplified the fear of hell and then promised salvation if you like do what we say. And is there a similar dynamic in modern medicine that the fear of like being in pain or having an untreated condition is kind of amplified in our culture, and the men in white coats are there to reassure you that, oh no, come to us and we'll make it all go away. And
Oh,
you've got to,
it's absolutely vivid in television advertising.
mm,
You know, one of the big problems in our society is that we've allowed the pharma companies to advertise on TV for the last 20 years or so, or 25 years. And they bombard the public, and also on the internet, they bombard the public with, you know, advertising, as we well know, uh, uses the basic strategy of saying that there's something wrong with you that you need to correct, and in order to buy our product to correct it, right? So that's the basic strategy. And so Americans are bombarded with ads for pharma products, informing them that they're all messed up, you know, that their hair is falling out and their gums are bad and their, you know, their sugar level is terrible and that and they are obese. You know, they have all these conditions. And so yeah, and they promise salvation, but unfortunately, the salvation has become a bit of a shuck and a hustle because you know the salvation is, oh, okay, we can take care of that problem for you, but it'll only cost you $114,000. You know, you're not feeling good. You have some kind of cancer. Oh, okay. Here's a cancer drug, $38,000 per pill.
mm, mm.
You know, I mean, that's only a small part of it, but you know, there's a great deal of hustle going on in the whole medical thing. People are aware of it. They're getting very, very angry about it. Um, and there you have it.
Do you think there is likely to be a major renegotiation of our cultural relationship with death in the 21st century?
Well, you could imagine that, I think, as maybe a fiction project or a movie project. But I think that the truth of the matter is that we're heading into a period of greater mortality rather than less mortality. You know, the billionaires are obviously they're intensely trying to prolong their lives every way possible and live to be 150 years old, or, you know, maybe be immortal. You have Ray Kurzweil, who used to be, he's gone through many incarnations as a techno narcissist. His latest one is he works for Google as some kind of a super, you know, brain trust guy. But he was the guy who created the singularity theory that there would be a meld between the human body and the machine technology that would allow us to our consciousness to expand and remain alive forever. You know, maybe he's right. Personally, I think he was wrong, and I wrote a chapter in a book, Too Much Magic, about that thing. So I don't think that's going to happen. I think what we're seeing now is a marked deterioration of human health and the return of a lot of diseases that we thought we'd vanquished, and the discovery that many of our super drugs have terrible side effects, and the lack of an ability to deliver high-tech medicine to a lot of people. You know, I think that that's going to diminish. And in fact, what I would imagine is that the whole infrastructure of medicine, which is returned to giantism again. You know, we have all these hospitals that are being bought up by holding companies and insurance companies. That's all headed for collapse, and very, very swiftly. And what somebody's going to have to do is kind of reinvent the idea of a local clinic where doctors do not they're not millionaires, you know, they're not millionaire entrepreneurs, that they no longer enjoy that kind of status, but they, you know, it's going to be a different thing. We're already seeing concierge medicine or boutique medicine. I myself have two doctors. I have my doctor associated with my insurance, my health insurance, who, you know, I won't go for something serious to see him. And then I have a concierge doctor who I pay $1,200 a year so that I can call him up and say, you know, I got a tick bite. and I need doxycycline. Can you call in a prescription? My own doctor would say, well, you're going to have to wait a month to see you, and complete bullshit.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are a lot of things you can't wait a month to see.
Mm,
You have all these, acute problems, and you call your doctor and he says, well, we can give you an appointment in February,
mm.
and it's September, right?
It's too late by then.
And you just cut your leg off with a chainsaw. Oh, well, we can see you in February for that. Anyway, so we're returning to the clinic model, to concierge medicine, doctors maybe even having to take their black bag to your house, and see you make a house call,
Mm,
something that hardly anyone remembers.
mm.
I
Um,
do.
Rounding back to politics, there's a couple of questions here I really want to get your perspective on. Um, there's these two trends happening at the same time, and one gets a lot more attention than the other. So obviously, the thing everyone is paying attention to is the polarization and like the ramping up of intensity, arguing over things. But then if you look a little bit more closely, people's trust in all sides of politics and all institutions is heading down and down and down. And I wonder if they're connected, if the politicians need to come up with ever more ridiculous attention grabbing things to talk about to counteract the fact that people are just checking out across the board.
Well, I think that is true across Western Civ, but it's worse in Europe and possibly worse in Australia than in America at the moment because for all of his buffoonery and inability to really articulate very clearly, Mr. Trump is actually accomplishing quite a bit for the moment and giving people some sense that he's interested in seriously reforming how we manage ourselves.
Mm,
I think that's much less true in Europe, where they are actively still destroying their culture, destroying their economies, beating war drums, and doing all kinds of absurd things. But what I see, I haven't been to Europe in a couple of years, but what I observe from afar is that I believe that they're headed for falling governments and internal chaos and uh, a lot of difficulty and disorder in Europe in a way that we haven't seen in our lifetime. In our lifetimes, Europe has become kind of a theme park for tourism. But it's once again, threatened with becoming a slaughterhouse, which it has been through many phases of history.
that's exactly
And
how I think of Europe. It's a theme park built on a graveyard.
there you go.
Mm,
And I'm very worried about that. It remains to be seen in the intermediate term if Mr. Trump can pull off something of a rescue of at least American political psychology, if not the actual management of the country. And the problems are pretty bad, and they're very hard to manage and get under control, especially the financial ones. And
mm,
that's the part that I'm probably most concerned about in the intermediate term, which is, that we might be headed into some kind of a currency or market crisis or banking crisis that would disable our politics and make it impossible for us to fix things.
mm, mm.
Um, well, have I lost the thread?
No, 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 that's okay. I'll move on. The other thing I wonder, has political life become so toxic that the only people willing to stand for public office are either crazy and or grifters? Like, would any sane and competent person want to be a politician today in the Western world?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it would appear to be something like that. Uh, Not so much, I think, in the conservative side of the transect, but certainly in the Democratic Party of the transect. They are the Democratic Party in America, which is the old sort of, liberal party, has become a party of hoaxes, liars, and hustles. and the leaders that they have now are hoaxers and hustlers, and they appear to be, as Mr. Trump would say, rather bad people. You know, the Gavin Newsoms and Jasmine Crockett's and AOCs of our politics don't have a whole lot to offer. And you see almost nobody coming up through American politics who might remedy the situation. The one exception might be Rahm Emanuel, who was Bill Clinton's chief of staff and then later mayor of Chicago. He's been kind of out of the arena for some years, but he's not that old. He's Jewish, which might be a problem for him now that we are in a new era of sort of anti-Israel, anti-Jewish sentiments. But he's one of the only people who seems to be sane and rational in that whole gang. Maybe the only one at the moment.
Mm.
Uh, Among the Republicans, there are a lot of people working in and around Mr. Trump who seem to be very, very capable people. And a deep bench, as we say in American sports. And the leadership failure is mostly on one side of the spectrum.
Mm. I also wanted to get your perspective on the idea that we often get caught in the trap of trying to fight the last war. But is the world today too old, too broke, and too dysfunctional for anything resembling World War III or even like a proper historic civil war? Are we just too frazzled to actually pull anything like that together?
Well, Europe, I don't think has the capability of prosecuting this war against Russia that they're imagining themselves doing. It just seems idiotic and insane. The Americans, I think Mr. Trump recognizes that we enjoy a great advantage, even in the age of missiles. We enjoy a great advantage of having two oceans separating us from the rest of the world. And I think he would like to restore a bit of American isolation from the problems of the rest of the world. The Ukraine war is a very peculiar situation. There's something very abnormal about it. One thing that's abnormal is that the USA is subsidizing the Ukraine side, which probably would have lost the war, in the first 12 months of the war, if it wasn't for America shoveling all of these munitions and armaments over there, and helping with the targeting and satellite imagery and all that stuff, and the drone technology. Um, I do think that in the natural course of things, it would be in the interest of everybody to allow Russia to win this war, which is to say, to just restore Ukraine as being in their sphere of influence, as the South American countries are in America's sphere of influence, and which the world understands to be the case. The world should understand that Ukraine is in Russia's sphere of influence. In fact, was the origination point of Russian culture in Kiev.
Mm.
And so they need to win that thing and put an end to it in a kind of a sanitary way that is going to allow Ukraine to be some kind of a sovereign, self-sustaining state, if possible, and not a failed state. Europe wants to turn it into a failed state, wants to turn Russia in turn into a failed state, but that project has no real possibility. So the sooner that Russia concludes that conflict, the better it's going to be for everybody.
Now, I want to leave plenty of time to talk about culture. And one question I've been really puzzling over lately is how is culture likely to evolve through the end of the internet and other digital technology? I've seen a lot of people, including yourself, imagine far beyond it's gone, but the actual process, like how do you get from there to here to there, is something that I haven't seen many people try and tackle. Have you thought about that much?
Yeah, a lot. And we're seeing some really peculiar turns in the drama of this. For example, take the movie industry. You know, the motion picture was the art form of the 20th century, and it's now in the process of completely destroying itself in America. We've become incapable of making, even with the fantastic technological improvements in movie making, the great cameras and the artificial, CGI and all that stuff. We can no longer tell a story,
Mm.
and as the preoccupation with social justice in Hollywood uh, got bigger and bigger, their ability to tell a story diminished. And now they can hardly tell a story at all that's coherent. And also, the theatrical exhibition of movies is dying or dead. We built a multiplex movie theater in the next big town near to us in Saratoga Springs. And we built that in the early 2000s, and nobody goes to the movies at all.
Mm.
And it's remarkable. So, I joke around about, if I was going to invest in any kind of an entertainment thing, I'd invest in a puppet theater
Ah, yes.
locally.
Yeah.
My fantasy is to put on Pinter plays in a puppet theater, and waiting for Godot in a puppet theater.
I
Um,
love it.
yeah, I'd like
But
to do that.
was theater
One more thing, though. I think
Oh, yep. Sorry.
it's
No, you,
there's a
after you. Mm.
there's a parallel movement in music. Um, the all the high tech wonders of the last 25 years have destroyed the music industry and destroyed music making for a lot of people. It's no longer a kind of industry you can go into and expect to make some decent money in. There are no more record labels anymore that really matter. You can't start a band and hope to get signed and get a signing bonus and then go on and make an album and collect royalties and live pretty well,
Mm.
even moderately. The live music venues have sort of shut down. Uh, I'm in an area that has a lot of local string band musicians. I play myself. I'll be going to a jam in a Celtic bar tonight. Um, but the professional musicians, the guys I used to know, they're just singing the blues. They can't get a show. They can't sell any CDs that they make themselves because they don't have a record label. They can't make a living. So I think we're devolving to a point where we may get back to having to make homemade music.
Was one of the redeeming qualities of television and cinema that it created a shared feeling, a shared experience that has been virtually obliterated by the internet. Culture's fragmented into a million tiny pieces, and there's no communal feeling around art anymore, even if it was
Yeah,
like
well,
degraded base art.
what you're describing is something that's part of an even bigger picture, which is, can you maintain what's called a common culture?
Mm.
And you see this so vividly in if we have a channel in America called Turner Classic Movies that shows all these 1930s and 40s movies. And the culture that they depict in these movies is so solid. There's such agreement among the individuals in the society about what reality is, you know? Uh, that is a very important thing, and it's one of the reasons that it's one of the reasons that America was able to win the Second World War, because we had such a sturdy common culture, and all of these different ethnic groups in America. As you see in a movie like Saving Private Ryan by Spielberg, you have the Italian guy and the Jewish guy and the WASP guy and you know, the this guy and that guy. But they're all just dog-faced soldiers in the U.S. Army fighting the Nazis. And you see a movie from the 1930s, and you see people, you see a Fred Astaire movie, and you see people who agree about what makes people happy and what makes them unhappy, and what love is and what love isn't, and what mating is all about, and finding a husband or a wife, and what your duties are as a man, and all of these points of agreement that are necessary. And so to have a common culture is really very important. And our common culture has been obliterated in America, and we haven't put together we haven't put one back together. Mr. Trump is trying in his clumsy way with these triumphalist demonstrations of, military power and golden objects in the White House and all this kind of symbolism that's pretty clunky, but it's not as fine-grained as having a fine-grained common culture where there are thousands and thousands of points of agreement about what's real and what's valuable,
Mm.
and how you treat people, and what your duties are as a citizen or a man or a husband or a wife or a friend.
On the flip side, could there be an upside to that? Like, if you're going to have something like a civil war, you need at least two well-defined, distinct sides that can fall into conflict. And sometimes in the Middle East, you see places where there's like six or seven different factions, and they just never seem to quite get anywhere with it. But what if you had thousands of different potential factions and nobody really knows what faction they're in? It's a completely different kind of disintegration and paralysis.
Well, I think in the long run, you do go, there's a sort of sine cosine wave form of going in and out of order and disorder.
Mm.
And we just happen to be in the disorder part. When I started out at the very beginning of this conversation saying the one thing that I never anticipated was how crazy the population would become as we moved forward in this long emergency. Um, we are probably, in or approaching a low point of psychological, social disorder,
Mm.
and a lack of a common culture and a atomization of culture. So, yeah, I would say this is a low point, and you can assume that at some point it self-organizes. We have to think of life as being um, emergent,
Mm.
and the essence of emergence as a feature of, physics or reality is that it's self-organizing. So systems, including human systems, respond to the messages that are coming to it from reality, and then it self-organizes. So that's it's a process, and it can be a pretty long, cumbersome process. Think about it in history.
Mm.
Uh, we're seeing right now what has evolved to be kind of a conflict between the sane and the insane. That seems to be pretty emphatically the case at the moment. Now, I could be persuaded that I'm wrong about it, but let's just assume for the sake of argument that that's what's going on. You have to look back at something like, the English Revolution of the Cromwells, the Puritans against the Royalists and the aristocrats, and you have to wonder how much that was uh, a conflict between the sane and the insane, and how much of it was based really on issues that could be that involved actually managing the country.
Mm.
Similarly, in the French Revolution, which was a very drawn out affair, and the beginning of it is understandable because you have great distress among the poor people and the proles and the working people of Paris, in contrast to the exorbitant luxury of Versailles. And you have a financial crisis that really sets off the revolution.
Mm.
But then, 4 years later, you get the Jacobins rising to power. And the Jacobins are pretty insane in the same way that the wokists are insane in America, or have been recently. The Jacobins want to deconstruct French society. They want to shut down the Catholic religion. They want to change the names of the days of the week. They want to have a 10-day week instead of a 7-day week, and they want to add a month to the calendar. They want to completely disorder the life of the country. And they do it for about a year, and in the process, they persecute anybody who objects, and they kill about 18,000 people in the guillotine.
Mm.
And, this goes on from like July of 1793 to July of 1794. And in 1794, all of a sudden, a bunch of people start throwing rotten tomatoes at Robespierre. And like 36 hours later, he's in a tumbril heading for the guillotine,
Mm.
right? And that's the end of the Jacobins. And we may see there's something similar going on here, especially after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, which was kind of an inflection point where all of a sudden uh, people have decided we're not putting up with this anymore in
I
a
guess
major way.
yeah, I guess it harks back to the idea that like when conditions become really volatile and unstable, only unstable people really like are attracted to the idea of like taking the helm. It's like who would apply to be the head, the captain of the Titanic after it's hit the iceberg? Like only a madman.
Yeah, and interestingly, you saw that happen after the French Revolution, and in the waning years of the French Revolution after 1794, you get this period of drift, right? Through the late 1790s, and then in this period of drift, 1 month, the population becomes restive again, and they start rioting in the streets. And there's this young artillery officer who's visiting Paris, and somebody in power, Barras, or I don't remember who it was at the time, was in power, says, "Oh, we got to get a guy to go out in the streets and put this latest little revolt down." So Napoleon Bonaparte is this 26-year-old artillery officer, goes out into the streets and gives the mob a whiff of grape shot. And, you know, I'm shortening this story up, but the short story is, after this, everybody turns to Napoleon Bonaparte and says, he's the guy.
Mm,
He's the guy who can restore order and get us out of this drift.
mm.
And indeed, he does. I mean, he swiftly rises at the age of like 27 or whatever,
He's the right
27
kind of
years old.
crazy for that moment.
Yeah,
Mm,
but actually, he wasn't that crazy. In fact, he was sane in a lot of ways that France had not seen in a long time. I
mm,
mean, after all, he was able to rewrite an entire French code of justice, which was so sturdy that it's still used today as the basis of their law.
mm,
So, his weak spot was that he lived in a certain moment of military history where he could not resist the urge to exercise his military organs. So he got into a lot of trouble doing that. And that was his downfall. But
mm,
what followed Napoleonism was the great century of European peace. Except for a few minor dust-ups like Crimea and the revolutions of 1848. It was the most remarkable, the post-Waterloo period from 1814 to 1914 was a remarkable period of European peace and prosperity and ushered in the industrial age and all which culminated in the magic and beauty of, Paris in 1900
mm, mm.
and the New York of 1900.
Mm, mm. I really want to get your perspective on a growing class of people. I call them the high functioning homeless. So there's a growing number of people who have full-time jobs. Sometimes they have families, but they're living out of cars or they're couch surfing, and they're kind of invisible at the moment. But they're so distinct from the low functioning homeless that get the most attention. The people who are addicted to drugs or have mental health issues or other major challenges. But there's these other people that are in the mix, and I've seen little glimpses of them in documentaries in the US, particularly after the housing collapse back in the late 2000s. And they're appearing in Australia too as our housing bubble gets like out of all proportion. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what uh, role, uh, what influence they might have on society as they kind of become more well, they're growing in numbers.
Yeah, well, there are people who they are people who by necessity are having to cope with a very bad situation. And as they're doing this, if they're young people especially, they are going to mature into very capable people who are problem solvers. And, if you look at the fourth turning history, so-called, or theory of history, I should say, the fourth turning is a generational theory that says, you have this transcendent generation, and then another generation of doers, and then another generation of slackers, and then another generation of kind of lost individuals, and then another generation of transcendent people. And I forget the categories. I haven't described them very well, but what you're seeing is maybe a generation coming along who are going to be quite different from the Gen Z lost nose ring people that we're seeing out there now, who don't seem to be able to do anything except make coffee drinks. And this generation you're describing of people who are desperately improvising a life and surviving, and even in some cases maybe even supporting children,
Mm.
is going to be a model for survival and for thriving. And one of the conclusions, or provisional conclusions we might draw, is that we are heading into a period of considerable hardship for a lot of people. And we're already in it, obviously.
Mm.
But it has further to go to really effloresce. And as that happens, it will produce people with new sort of thought systems in politics that will be different from, just MAGA or communism or easy categories that we have today that we flip people into. And I think it'll be pretty refreshing.
I wonder, like, I look back at history of like these sprawling, decaying empires that get overrun by nomads from the periphery who often like take up the reins of power, like the Mongols took over the Chinese empire. And there's been other cases like that. I mean, I guess Rome briefly was overrun by
The
the Huns.
Visigoths and the
Yeah,
Germans and the
and I wonder if that class who have that mobility and nothing to lose and are quite capable could be that. Well, if you don't have like organic Mongols on your periphery, you kind of have to make ones at home from scratch.
well, we're seeing both. Look, the Home Secretary of Britain is now a Muslim,
Mm, mm,
and there are a lot of people who fear that Britain will be simply overtaken by Muslims and by Islam and become an Islamic, jihad state. It looks to me like it's, they're in danger. Now, you have to ask yourself why a character like Keir Starmer would allow that. And, the Britons seem to be asking themselves that now. We seem to be on the verge of Britain of some kind of a great eruption of nationalist wrath. And I think that it's coming, and Nigel Farage will probably be the instrument of it in the
mm.
short term. In America, well, Joe Biden imported God knows how many millions of mutts from overseas, and some of them are going to prove to be capable people, and some of them are going to prove to be just a new lumpen prowl mass of mutts. I don't think that they really improved the country, and we have no idea where it's going with that. Mr. Trump is trying to bum rush a lot of them back out of the country, and he's having some success. He's gotten more than 1 million of them to self-deport back to their countries by offering financial incentives to do it. Actually, and carrots and sticks, because the stick will be that if you don't do it, it's going to be a rather punishing journey for you out of here, and we might end up having to take you to some place like Uganda or Somalia. Um, and they've been dumping, South Americans in African countries now.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a messy situation.
it's a messy situation. So yeah, but it would seem superficially to be a kind of parallel the Mongol invasion of Europe, or the Islamics attempted it once in Europe in you know the Middle Ages,
Mm.
and they were expelled from Spain, and they were resisted at Vienna and could not, then pushed back to Turkey. And that has been the disposition of things ever since. But now they seem to be, if 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 only outbreeding the Europeans, in a position to take over their societies. I suppose you read uh, the novel Submission
No, I haven't actually.
by I forget the name of the author. Um, but Submission was a French novel about the sort of final turnover of France to Muslim occupation in our times, or future times just ahead. It's a very daunting picture of the world.
Mm.
So I'm very concerned about the Muslim overtaking of Western Civ. It doesn't. It really bothers me, and we're not supposed to talk about it. It's Islamophobic, but you can call me Islamophobic. I don't care. I think it's something that's worth worrying about.
Do you think the predominance of concern about Islamophobia is a counter-reaction to like the Bush era, like bombing the shit out of like one Middle Eastern country after another, that it's a kind of reaction in the other direction?
Well, I mean, if you look at it, it kind of looks like revenge. We've caused a lot of mayhem in the Islamic world.
Mm.
The U.S. in particular and alone has created a lot of mayhem in the Islamic world over the last 30 years and or so or
Mm.
more.
Mm. Mm.
So yeah, that would seem to be kind of self-evident.
Now, to wrap up, I've put together some questions more focused on you and your personal journey and the impact of all your work. I watched your 2007 TED Talk again, and
Oh,
it's hilarious, and it's still so salient. And it made me wonder, like, what makes you laugh today, and has it gotten harder over time? Like, do you look back on that era, and it's like, oh, we were so carefree, and
no, I don't look back on it as being carefree. I look back on it as being nerve-wracking because I was on airplanes a lot, going around giving college lectures and just having to be subjected to the American aviation system is just a terrible punishment. It's like some kind of hellish journey. So that was, yeah, I don't look back on that happily, but yeah, there's a lot to be. Look, Samuel Beckett said it best. He said, "Nothing is funnier than unhappiness," and I think is a good starting point for understanding how comedy works. And there's a great deal of unhappiness in our country, and therefore there's a great deal of potential for comedy. So, for one thing, I just wrote a novel that takes place in 1963, the week of the John F. Kennedy assassination. And it's a comedy.
hmm hmm
Uh, it's coming out in November, and which is the time of year that JFK was murdered. And it's about a 12-year-old kid who comes home from a boarding school, and he is at large in New York City that week. And he has a bit of a romance with another teen, pubescent teen. Doesn't work out. He has a little conflict with the KGB guards at the Russian mission to the UN, who he tangles with. And he ends up in J.D. Salinger's kitchen in New Hampshire in a blizzard arguing about Eastern religion
Oh, wow.
with J.D. Salinger.
That sounds
So
like a delight.
it's a wonderful book. I'm very satisfied with it. I was very glad that I was able to use J.D. Salinger as a character in fiction now that he's been dead for 15 years or so. And when people pass away, you can make them into to characters in historic novels and
One,
historical novels.
one thing I've found really surprising, when I picked up World Made by Hand and started reading it, I got like, I don't know, a chapter or two in, and I'm like, did I get the right book? Is this the Kunstler that I've been writing? I've been reading his blogs for so long, and that novel is so earnest and sincere and so in love with that society. And your blogging is so acerbic and critical and feisty. And how do you reconcile those two aspects of the way that you can see the world?
I don't know, it might be two different portions of my brain. On the one hand, I write about things that are very upsetting. And on the other hand, I'm basically a pretty cheerful person. I'm I've had to discover that I've had to discover in age that I'm actually quite fortunate. I have lived a long time, and that's alone is something to be grateful for. I lead a purposeful life. I'm never bored or lonely. Um, in fact, you know, Georgia O'Keeffe, the painter, once observed that the cure for loneliness is solitude.
Mm,
An interesting point.
mm,
I have other parts of my existence that are very rewarding. I'm a very serious painter. My paintings are in one of the pages of my website, kunstler.com. And so I'm out there, sur le motif in the world, trying to see what I'm looking at and depict it in two dimensions on canvas. And I get a tremendous amount of reward out of that. And people actually buy my paintings and pay a considerable amount of money for them. So, there's a little bit of financial incentive for that. Uh, I love writing. I don't suffer from writer's block. I've learned how to get into that mental condition called flow that was described in the book Flow by the author Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. I think he's a Slovakian or something. He has a weird name, but it's a great book, Flow.
mm, mm.
Just search for Flow by Mihaly and you'll get it. And it describes, the process of mental engagement and how you get to that point and how you put aside all the needless psychodrama and suffering and procrastination that a lot of people go through. For many years, I've gotten letters from wannabe writers who want me to help them try to get published or, give them some validation for what they've written and stuff like that. And I've encountered a lot of people who are very talented and yet they can't persevere. Uh, and I've had to give them the bad news that perseverance actually counts more than talent.
Mm, mm.
You have to just, as they say in the military, you have to embrace the suck. You have to, you have to somehow get comfortable with being uncomfortable and get through the disappointment and the rejection and just keep on doing what you're doing. And I was able to do that. I was still waiting on tables when I was 40 years old and I published 8 novels, and I was still showing up, waiting on tables. And yet and then my fortunes turned and I was able to, live like a normal human being.
Do you think
And
the era of the novel might be in the past? And if
absolutely.
should young creatives be putting their energy into, puppet show productions of plays rather than making another, huge stack of text.
It is really amazing that what we have assumed to be enduring institutions turn out to be so fragile.
Mm,
You know, as we discussed earlier, the motion picture, which was the art form of our time, is absolutely falling apart.
mm,
The novel, which was the art form of my parents' and grandparents' time, is disappearing because people are too distracted by their little screens, and they just don't have their lives are too frantic to allow them to put aside an hour a day to read a book. And so the book as an artifact, it looks like it may disappear. Now, I keep on producing them in the twilight of their existence, because I'm good at doing it and I'm used to it. I know how to do it, and I found a way to do it.
mm.
But I could see the novel being an anachronism very, very shortly. Now, luckily, there are thousands upon thousands of them out there already, enough to keep the human race occupied for quite a while. The trouble is as time goes by, they may not even recognize the language that's used, and they may not recognize the modes of social life that are represented in these novels, as we have quite a bit of trouble with Shakespeare and Ben Jonson. It's not easy to penetrate the lingo of Shakespeare or the social relations that he's describing.
I wonder
You have
about the
to.
resource demands of novels too. Like, I can hardly imagine a monk in a monastery copying out 50 Shades of Grey on parchment by hand to like preserve this amazing thing. Like, so much of our
You got
culture
it.
could be flushed, and we might actually be better off for it.
Well, I'll give you an example. Many of us have read a lot about Roman history. Do you have any idea what Roman music sounded like?
I think there's a couple of fragments, but even they're kind of
I mean,
dodgy
we don't even,
reconstructions. Yeah.
yeah, we don't know what their musical notation was, if they
Mm,
had any.
mm,
Did they even have it? I'm not even sure. Maybe they did, but they
mm.
didn't have anything like the musical notation that Bach had, or that George Gershwin had, and it's like unknown. So it vanished. It must have been a mighty corpus of Roman music.
Mm.
And it's all gone. I mean, for all we know, it sounded like you know James Taylor. I don't know. We
Oh,
don't know.
I have one really, I don't know if I've seen people ask you this question before, but I've followed your blogging when you pivoted from peak oil and urban design more into politics and culture wars. And I'm really curious about like what that was like to experience as you had kind of friction and frisson in the target audience as it kind of realigned to your new interests.
Well, yeah, I did it because I thought, like many uh, conservatives now in America. I mean, I was a registered Democrat for 40 years. I only changed my registration like 3 weeks ago,
Mm,
finally, out of just sheer inertia. But I now have to consider myself a conservative, and in the process, I thought that my country needed to be rescued. My point of view of this is not that different from Mr. Trump's, although he speaks about it differently. The country really needs to be rescued. I don't know if it can be, and I saw myself having a role in doing it. I wasn't too grandiose about it. I just sort of eased into it, and I my I kind of learned how to do the blogging thing. There are some important aspects of it that are worth saying. One is you got to keep it short because people have a very short attention span, and I keep it fairly short and try to make it as pithy as possible and as concise as possible. And you got to show up absolutely regularly over the long haul. I don't think I've missed a blog in 20 years.
mm, mm.
And so people can rely on you being there. And that's how to succeed at it and how to even be able to make a living at it. People who only put up a blog when they feel like it or, once every 3 months or something, they're not going to make it.
Mm, mm.
Um, Now, as a personal matter, I lost almost all of my old friends from taking the political positions I did. Being against the Democratic Party and being against wokery and all of that it represents. So all my old friends are gone, and I'm in a kind of a logistical situation where it's very hard to make new friends because I live in a small town, a very small town, fairly geriatric, and fairly rural and it's hard to meet people here. And when you get older, it's hard to meet people, period, because people your age just don't go out after dinner.
Mm.
You're not going to meet them in a pub. Plus, we don't have any pubs.
Mm.
Public space, one of the elements of the suburbanization of America is, and is well known, is that we have a poverty of public places, of
Hmm.
public space, that of the kind that really makes for good social relations and meeting people and stuff like that. We don't have the plaza that the Italians have, the piazza, where you go out at twilight on a pleasant summer evening and circulate and meet people, talk to your friends.
Mm.
We don't have that. And it's hard to meet people. Everybody's just home with their screens. So,
Do you think there are more
uh,
innovative ways of using the internet that haven't taken off in the mass culture? Like algorithmic, commercial, conglomerated social media has like colonized the space so rapidly. And do you think there's still potential to push back against that on more human scales? If we can't rebuild the suburbs, we can at least rebuild the internet for ourselves.
uh, I really don't know. I see a lot of people working hard in every little niche and corner of the internet to try to do new things that the internet makes possible.
Mm.
In the process of trying to reconfigure my life as a novelist, which I've had to do because basically the major trade publishers in America do not want to publish old white men anymore. Old white guys. We're out. We're just out. I mean, it's not racist to say that. It's just a fact. We've been kind of banished from publishing, especially if you're a conservative. And regardless of the fact that a lot of my work is neither, left or right. So I've had to figure out a new business model. And what I'm doing now is publishing with a small boutique publisher, just as I have a concierge physician. I have a boutique publisher. We have a different royalty relationship than the trade publishers of yore. I get a better royalty rate, but there are certain things that I have to pay for in the process of publication. I have to pay for my own author copies of the book. I
Mm.
have to pay for certain publicity things. I paid for my own copy editor. So, when it's all over, I'll rack up maybe $2,500 in costs to publish my book. But my publisher is devising all kinds of internet novelty things to make the publication of the book work better. For example, this week he asked me for a reading sample of a recorded voice reading my own novel so he could use AI to create an audiobook
Mm. Mm.
using my voice, a sample of my voice for the whole book,
Mm.
and you can do that. Now, we haven't really seen the results of that yet. I've got a file in my email waiting for me to demonstrate. Um, so, there's that. And there are new kind of networking and marketing um, internet utilities that allow you to get the notice of your book around because the infrastructure of book reviewing is gone away. It's
Mm.
melted away. It
Mm.
doesn't exist anymore. So how do people find out about new books? It's very hard. It's just like, how do you find out about new rock and roll bands? Well, the answer is you don't,
Mm.
because nobody listens to FM radio anymore. Really, the only way you might find out is on a utility like Pandora, where you create a station for like Eric Clapton, and every third song they'll slip in a new artist. that you haven't heard before, and you'll think, oh, geez, I haven't heard that song before. It's a good song. Who did that? And you'll look at your phone, and you'll see that it's a band you never heard of before. But
Mm.
otherwise, it's very hard to get attention.
Well, if
So
if the business model of journalism online is more or less broken, the one for curation, I think, is like 10 times worse. The people who used to
yeah,
do
yeah,
that as a
absolutely.
profession are gone.
Yeah, and you need that in a culture. It's one of the things that helps you to build a sturdy common culture where there is agreement about what is good stuff and what is bad stuff.
Mm, mm,
And that's all gone now. Now, I'm also fortunate that, I have a somewhat popular blog, and I'm able to advertise my own book on my own blog, and I'll probably gin up sales primarily that way.
mm.
In the final years that I published with a mainstream publisher, which was Grove Atlantic Books, published my last 7 books out of about 23. Um, Grove Atlantic, by the way, after I finished the World Made by Hand series, they turned around and said, "Don't you dare write any more fiction." I'm like, what? Did you really say that? So so I bugged out of there, and because I want to write fiction,
Mm.
and um, so anyway, so I have this this new model, and we'll see how it works. But as you said, we have cause to wonder whether the book itself is getting to be a kind of antique art form.
Do you have any guess what might be the next thing, the next medium, the next form that
Yeah, homemade
takes over?
stuff.
Okay.
Yeah,
Mm,
puppet shows, homemade music, the piano in the parlor again, if we can salvage a few pianos, because I don't know if we're going to be able to make them again. We may be too dumb to do that.
mm,
Yeah, homemade music, homemade theater, homemade storytelling, homemade entertainment.
mm.
Maybe, some form of vaudeville, in a new style. I don't know how much of it will actually be mixed media or electronic media. I gotta say, at some point, I do think that the electric grid is gonna pop, and we just may not have access to it anymore, or it may be sporadic for a while, and But ultimately, I'm not too sanguine about that.
Mm, mm. Oh, I have one final fun question. Do you have a secret guilty pleasure from the world of industrial excess, or are you a purist on that front?
Oh, geez. Well, I have a lot of them. Yeah. I mean, I'm lucky that I can use industrially produced oil paints.
Hmm.
They've only been around for about 175 years. Um, Before that, the artists had to grind their own colors in many cases, and then, make paints. They used to store them in pigs' bladders. They jam a certain amount of paint in a pig bladder, prepared paint, and then they'd have a tack on a string attached to the bladder. And when they wanted more paint, they'd stick it in the bladder, squeeze it out onto their palette. And that's how they did it. Very, very complex and cumbersome, time-consuming business. I can go to a store and buy, a tube of alizarin crimson and cadmium orange, and squeeze it out on my palette, and go. So I'm very fortunate about that.
Mm.
I don't know. Just about everything about industrial civilization is a guilty pleasure. Just being able to throw a light switch with the expectation that the light will go on. You know,
Mm. Mm.
if you've ever spent any time in an unelectric home, uh, there's an awful lot that you have to do to make stuff happen, to
Yeah.
cook a meal or stay warm. It takes all of your effort to do that.
Yeah, it's a big shock to the system and a
Yeah.
wake up call. And I don't know. I'm trying to encourage people to appreciate what's left of the industrial era while it lasts, and
Yeah.
not 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 regard it all with bitterness and regret.
Yeah, and there you are in lovely asteroid belt of Brisbane, Australia, with your wallabies, and wannabes and other things that bees.
Mm-mm.
And your palm trees, you're in a mild climate up there anyway, unlike me.
The
I'm in a
this
rather harsher climate.
the snakes and the ticks love it too. So yeah, it's not all sunshine.
Oh, you have ticks there too?
Yeah, yeah, or paralysis ticks that can actually be quite directly
Oh
toxic.
dear.
Yeah, it's all fun. It's all fun. But
I know that
um,
you have a lot of snakes and spiders that are poisonous.
yes, yeah, the venomous snakes have just woken up from their winter rest and they're horny and jumpy. So you've got to keep your eyes open when you're wandering
Ah,
around the farm. But I wanted to say thank you for what has been an amazing conversation. I haven't kept you too long, but every bit of it has been fascinating. Do you want to do a final plug if people are looking at ways of following up and
oh, sure. Well,
find
just to put
where
it
can they find your
simply,
material? Yeah.
my website is www.kunstler.com. That's
Mhm.
Kunstler.com. And my blog, Clusterfuck Nation, is there every Monday and every Friday. It comes out at 9 o'clock in the morning or earlier, New York time. And my books are all on that web page. My web page is all on Substack now. My web page got attacked and shut down in October of last year in the climax of the political season. And I think that certain parties in power didn't appreciate what I was saying about Kamala Harris. So I had to move it all to Substack. So that's where I am. My new book is called Look, I'm Gone. Takes place in 1963, the week of the Kennedy assassination, and it's a comedy. And it comes out in November. You'll start seeing ads for it on my blog in the weeks ahead. And that's really all I got to say.
I'll make a note to coordinate putting this episode out to synchronize with that book release so people can
That'd be
jump
great.
straight on it and push it to the top of the charts.
Let's hope
Um,
the banking system doesn't collapse in the meantime, because it's a
absolutely.
season for that here.
Oh, yeah, you've got a hurricane season and banking collapse season.
Yeah,
And
they coincide pretty much.
oh, well, brilliant. James, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. And yeah, this has been wonderful.
Namaste, Shane. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to check out and sign up for the Recombination Nation Substack. There you'll find updates from my experimental farm, book reviews and think pieces on evolution, agriculture, history, technology. They're free every week, or you can get a paid subscription to unlock the archive of past posts from the last few years, plus the audiobook for Taming the Apocalypse. Next week, I'll be interviewing Gail Tverberg from Our Finite World about how resource limits are strangling the global economy.